Welcome to the NC Spin After Spin. Additional comments from our panelists just available on our website. John Hood, what do you wish you had said last week, but you didn't?
Tom, we talked about the North Carolina protests that in some cases devolved into riots last week in response to the George Floyd killing in Minnesota. And I think Cash, maybe multiple people mentioned that where we need to get to is to listen and start talking about solutions. I think that there is one possible solution. I mean, there are many different things that can be done in response to police misconduct, but I think one of the key issues is a legal one. Which is that some decades ago, the federal judiciary began to interpret an old statute in a very expansive way that provided what's called limited or qualified immunity for actors acting on behalf of the government and basically making it hard to sue them when they do something wrong. The Supreme Court had a meeting last week. There's been several cases that have gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court about this question of qualified immunity. Interestingly, the people who are critical of it span the political spectrum and the judicial spectrum. One of the most persuasive arguments I've seen against it is from Clarence Thomas, who argues that essentially courts have invented a fairly large amount of protection for government actors that was never intended by the people who wrote the law. It's certainly not consistent with our policies, and that people should be held more liable when they act on government's behalf, in this case police officers. The standard just makes it too hard. It's not impossible to sue a police officer when a police officer engages in misconduct, but it's very difficult. And as much as you want to rely upon criminal prosecution, as we're seeing in Minneapolis right now, that is not a sufficient check. Right. For a variety of reasons. So I think that changing the law either through federal legislation, through federal court decision, and also action at the state level would be a good idea to subject the small minority but very dangerous minority of police officers who engage in deadly, unjustified violence. They need to be held accountable both in criminal law if possible and also in civil litigation.
And I agree with the comment that was made on the show about we need to be listening more. I don't think there's any question about it, particularly those of us who are whites. But one thing I would like to hear added to this discussion is what is appropriate response for particular violations? I mean, in this particular case, George Floyd's charge was that he was passing a counterfeit piece of money. Maybe strangleholds and things of that nature just aren't appropriate responses, and I think we ought to have some more conversation on that. Would you agree?
I would. Of course, the argument is that he was resisting arrest. This is always the argument. Of course, lots of times offenders who don't commit very serious crimes still resist arrest, and they have to. There has to be a response from law enforcement. But I would also caution us not to think about this as purely a matter of race. Obviously, that's a significant issue. But remember that most Americans killed every year. There's about 1,000 unarmed Americans who die in contact with police every year. About a third of them are African American. That is disproportionate to their population, but most are not. This is not simply a question of that. It's a broader question as well of police conduct and police training.
And I just have to say, to add to footnote what you were talking about, the person who was riding with George Floyd in the car said he did not resist arrest.
Yeah, we don't know. This is going to have to be tested
part of
in
the
court.
trial.
But of course, it doesn't matter whether he was resisting arrest. After he was subdued, then the police officer had his knee on the guy's neck for more than 8 minutes. That is no longer an attempt to subdue a offender who is resisting arrest.
Right.
Obviously, George Floyd was not resisting arrest at that point.
No doubt about it. And that was not an appropriate response. Well, thanks for watching the After Spin. We'll have more video all during the week on ncspin.com.